watched the film, enjoyed it, and there's lots of beautiful discussions. I would like to welcome Thomas to give his speech, his presentation. It's called Black and Brown and...
Between black and brown in two parts?
Between black and brown in two parts. So, welcome Thomas.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks. I changed the title, right?
Yeah.
And I asked you because... Good afternoon, everyone. Because when Rachel asked me to come to participate in this sequence of events, the talks today, the conference, and I said to you, I didn't really know what to really talk about. How would I find a topic? There's so many things to talk about, right? And I began to think that maybe what I could do, and I tried to do what I've written, is to do a kind of detective work in looking at language, the language that I specifically have used in some of the fiction that I've written in recent period, and some of the work that I'm working on now, since I really think of myself really as a fiction writer more than anything else, in spite of the other things that I've done, you know? And to think about why, in terms of the work that I've done that's been centered in Jamaica fictionally, how I came to write those particular things, and what was it about the language and the questions that I needed to ask in writing the fiction that actually generated the fictions themselves. And thinking very much, as I hope I've made clear in the talk, thinking about class and being from the middle class in Jamaica, a very specific milieu in Upper St. Andrew, in Norbrook, which I'll also discuss if you know the geography, and how I came to some of these interests. And I was saying, actually, in writing this piece, I'm very glad that my parents aren't here, because they would not be pleased with some of what I have to say. But it is, to me, it's interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the talk that I wrote for today, and at times I'll also read from some of the works that I'm actually talking about. So the part one of the two parts is titled Racialized Hoods, Listening and Watching. If you know the word hood as I'm using it in this context refers to, it would actually mean, I think, not even penis really, but cock or dick in the vernacular, we're speaking about a male sexual organ. You see, I begin to stumble already, right? So very, you know, okay. Glad the minister's not here either. All right. So during the years that I regularly attended, and I'm thinking very much of what Alison said this morning vis-a-vis identity, right? Gay, lesbian, or queer parties in Jamaica, always in a very middle class, upper middle class context where these parties were held, and I'll talk about that. From the late 1990s until roughly 2008, I had no idea how ultimately invaluable would be the cultural information, and in particular, the specific and very nuanced information in regard to gay middle class and working class men and women, and some of the relational dynamics between them. Information that I gleaned over the years simply by watching and by listening and even eavesdropping. Habits that so many creative writers, if we're fortunate, discover are critical for the execution of our craft, toward learning how different people, individuals, really speak, what those people do and don't say, and what the said and the unsaid, and often the unspeakable, disclose to us as writers about our characters, and about the societies in which we and they lived. Speaking from my own experience, and the experience of the writers whose work I've generally found most interesting, it would seem that a writer's refined ear for spoken language must also learn to discern and must assist the writer in rendering on the page a very difficult task. The differences not only between particular words used by particular characters for their quite specific reasons, but also the ways in which tone often operates. Something as ostensibly simple yet complex as the difference between the utterance murmured in a tone, I recall, used often by certain women, especially women of a certain age, in my family, always potent with meaning, and delivered in a tone often employed by an uncle I'm thinking of in particular, an Uncle font of emphasis without any accompanying words. I've since learned that the usage and deliveries of these mhms are not necessarily gendered, not necessarily, although in my family one rarely heard or hears today men who present themselves as unquestionably heterosexual using the first tone, at least for someone who writes fiction, myself, right? It's fascinating to observe that even in the matter of the quotidian women appear to have a little more choice in how they speak than do men at the present time, at least so it seems for those men who present themselves as unquestionably heterosexual. So I believe, and I've come to believe more over time, that much of a creative writer's work, the invention and the shaping of characters in fiction, and one's own sustained and deeply personal private dialogues with those characters as the person imagining and writing them, takes place in obviously the profoundly interior realm, where both language and thought work hand in glove with what I will call intuition. And just let that go for the moment. Intuition and even dreams. I suspect that it was within this interior realm of imagining, intuition, and dialogue with myself and with shadowy figures who, although I couldn't know it then, were developing into future characters who would populate my fiction, that I began to think about and question why so many of the sexual remarks I heard at the queer parties in Kingston and St. Andrew, remarks about the alleged size of someone's penis, or whether or not he only took hood, was exclusively anally receptive in sex, or bottom in global North queer male parlance, or if he was a man who also ground, penetrated, and took hood, or the gossip that I heard occasionally about someone's legendary ability to ejaculate semen when lying flat on his back in bed, all the way up to the ceiling. I began to think, I actually heard these things, right? And it's all useful material. I began to, for writing purposes, right? You're very bad at it. But I began to think about and question why these sorts of sex-focused remarks usually, though not always, carry a racial tinge, as in, and I'll translate if it's not clear. You see that the black boy there? Me think say, must say I want big wood. So that black man, that dark-skinned man, probably has a big penis, right? In patois uttered by, as I recall hearing it, a black or a brown man or a Chinese Jamaican. I never heard, interestingly, as far as I can remember, this is like very casual and not terribly responsible sociology, but I never heard, as far as I can remember or saw, a white Jamaican or somebody who identified as such make such remarks in the public space of a party, keeping in mind that white Jamaicans, for whatever reasons, rarely seem to attend these parties, at least those that I attended, in large numbers, if at all. I'm not quite sure. That's just my perception, so I'm clearly not doing a complicated study, you know? Or another remark, them say that brown man can suck, you see? I heard this comment made by a young black man, or uttered by a black or brown young man with slightly malicious playfulness to a friend, also either black or brown, who had managed to hook up with a handsome black man and would soon depart the party with him. Hi! That the black boy will be a murder tonight and hot up your pussy hole. So that black man is going to give you a rough time in bed tonight when he really penetrates you to the end of the earth. Yeah? I was aware of how these remarks, also heard occasionally in other gay male-only contexts, seem to focus more on the hood or cock, and its presumed actual and or imagined size and prowess. At least within the realm of public discussion and banter at the parties, large, even monster penises were and still are more desirable and in fashion. Additionally, and no doubt, not surprisingly, they were, for a host of reasons, inextricably linked to art history, almost invariably linked to darker skin. Small penises were, again, within the public party realm, more often than not scorned, and associated by and large with men of East Asian background, Chinese Jamaicans, for example, and men perceived to be white, whether from Jamaica or elsewhere. Flat and less desirable buttocks, as opposed to those rounder and generally apparently more desirable, were also associated, I found, with East Asian, Chinese Jamaicans, and white men. Yet, even as a good deal of banter and speculation focused on penises, usually it seemed the penis of another man not within earshot as opposed to one's own penis, it seemed that very little conversation centered on the so-called pussy, as some men were inclined to refer to their anus, especially in deepest privacy and during the intimacy of sex with a trusted partner, right, who wouldn't go and gossip, whom they know would neither scorn, revile, nor speak in street, on the road, and so, about their use of the word, and who, by way of role-playing, might affirm, that partner that is, might affirm that their pussy, or man pussy, or boy pussy, and it's very difficult for me to say these words, trust me, was remarkably tight, or virginal, or brave, as in brave enough to engage with and grip an especially large penis. The word and notion of a man's pussy, especially as a body part possessed by a more masculine man who secretly or more openly may have enjoyed being anally penetrated, seemed unspeakable. When in very private moments I heard a man referring to his pussy, the word was never accompanied, interestingly, by a racializing adjective, unlike the racializations that always attended and perhaps even obscured the penis. And you'll notice I'm speaking a lot about the men here. I speak about women in a very different context in some other writing that I've done. That's a very, very, very different kind of analysis, obviously because of the not only gender differences, but also the penis being here. I was wondering, what is the thing about the projectile always being commented on and racialized? I wanted to really understand that. And this pussy that I couldn't quite pin down, if you'll pardon the pun. As more time passed, I've been really and truly, I mean, this is, as more time passed, I began to note with great interest that absolutely no Jamaican writer anywhere had written about this particular milieu of Jamaican society, that is to say, these parties and so on, but particularly this pussy and racialized penis thing, a milieu well hidden from many heterosexuals' eyes. Not even actually Patricia Powell, who wrote about something very different, as Alison talked about this morning with A Small Gathering of Bones. Yeah? Of even greater interest was the fact that no Jamaican writer had yet explored the race, color, and masculinity dynamics present in the pussy and hood racialized talk that I'd overheard at the parties, and certainly hadn't explored what I'd sensed was a very large and abiding male anxiety about and concern with masculinity, going back to some of what Sarah talked about this morning. In fact, as far as I could see, no Caribbean writer anywhere across language groups, not even the daring late Renato Arenas from Cuba, who had written so abashedly and unself-censoringly about deeply erotic, sexual and romantic encounters between men in Cuba, had written about such matters. It seemed that what I had gradually grown to suspect and had observed in Jamaican gay or queer male life was actually true. How we felt about and experienced our bodies as sexually active, same-gender inclined men in Jamaican society, as men who lived, desired, and sought pleasure, the erotic, and romance in Jamaican spaces, while also remaining accountable to the society by way of innumerable tacit social contracts, was indeed in many ways unspeakable. Although some of the ways in which we talked about other men's penises, and sometimes our own, reflected and echoed the almighty big penis thundering heard in the music of some dance hall singers, although heard always in a heterosexual, to use a word we heard this morning, heteronormative context, as some of our gay or queer men's, with same-gender inclined men's, preoccupations with skin color, and especially with brownness, brownness and blackness were reflected in the music as well, although again, always in the context of heterosexual relationships and desire. So this, again, there was a kind of invisibleness and invisibility of this concern. So why, I began to wonder, were no Caribbean writers, absolutely none, writing about this male so-called pussy and its place in men's longing for and their fantasies about sexual and romantic intimacy that could incorporate such forbidden language? Why were we as men who had desired and had sexual and romantic relationships with other men so apparently ashamed of this word, this pussy, which we said so enthusiastically in private, as we so unquestioningly subscribe to racialized, fetishizing desire for other men that invariably included therefore better and or worse colored penis? What might it mean for a fiction writer to imagine such unspeakable and theretofore unexplored, unexplained realities. Realities unexplained and unconsidered literarily in the context of queer Jamaican desire and queer Jamaican life. The imagining is complicated by the Byzantine realities of Jamaican social class structures that we inherited mostly, if not entirely, from the British, and some would argue had refashioned to our own inimitable Jamaican style, and which often prevailed at the parties of those social class structures, but were also often crossed, or as some might say, actually violated. So how does a fiction writer display and deploy and illustrate and transcribe on the page a language often used only in secrecy, that is heavily laden with desire, and in the case of the long fictional work I eventually wrote, partly in consideration of these questions, titled Out There, as Rachel mentioned this morning, how do I talk about and represent a desire that is not only utterly illicit, but also dangerous in many ways, and at times, in fact, revolting, in this case, in the story's case, to the brown middle-class man who desires the poor black man for whose body he yearns and with whom he craves, as seemed the case to me, some kind of intimacy. As it turned out, I'll read from the story shortly, in writing the work that became Out There, published in 2008 as the concluding work in my collection, The Torturer's Wife, I would seek to explore these questions, although not necessarily aware that I was exploring them when immersed in drafting and redrafting the fiction. Yet the explorations in Out There would clearly not be enough, for I would ponder the questions once again, although with an entirely different approach and with completely different characters, although characters situated in a similar class milieu to that of those in Out There, in a subsequent short fiction work titled Leighton, Leanne, Norbrook, written in 2011 and published in 2012 in the anthology Kingston Noir, edited by the Jamaican fiction writer Colin Channer. And I have a note here, writers invited to submit work for consideration in Kingston Noir were told that the book's concept would center on each writer's having writing about specific Kingston neighborhoods. And I instantly selected Norbrook, the Upper St. Andrew neighborhood, so not technically Kingston, but the Upper St. Andrew neighborhood in which I spent nearly all of my youthful time when in Jamaica. So yet, still another question lingers for me. The writer as architect or draftsman feels one way about Leighton's protagonist, the story Leighton's protagonist, Leighton Anderson. He's a problematic individual, and I'll just read a little bit to show you what I mean by that. I think it hopefully will be clear. But how does the writer, as an occasional reader of his own work, and as a gay man or queer man, in my case, of Jamaican background with abiding ties to Jamaican society and culture, feel about this character? How to feel about a character who, with what might be described as a frenzy of something approaching malevolent desire, privately conjures the object of his desire, object being maybe a key word here, as the nasty, dirty black boy, as Leighton refers to the object of his desire, Michael. The boy, who happens to be a fully grown man, whose blackhood, Leighton, who's brown, clearly wants so much within his own brown body. He wants nearly unto, or actually unto the point of real or imagined violence. In fact, in a manner similar to Aston Leslie's desire for his fisherman, even as Leighton simultaneously reviles that black body. And I'll read a little bit from each piece now to give you a sense of what I'm talking about with the desire and violence. So this first selection is going to be from Out There. And first of all, I'm going to just read a little bit of Bratty's language. Solomon is the fisherman who's the object of desire, Aston's desire, who's a working class poor man living out in St. Thomas, fishes, and Aston comes out there to buy fish from him regularly. So this is Solomon talking about how he got the name Bratty. Of course, every Jamaican must have a pet name, or many Jamaicans have a pet name, as do I. My uncle, Solomon had told Aston early on, that was my mother, brother. Him did all the while tell my mother said that me would go to be one spoil that picnic, because she never one day cane me. Even when they run up and down the road with all the other boy them round the place so. Him did always tell her, say, you have to spoil that the boy there. And it said to her, so did stay always vex up. And did always that kind of thinky. But trust me, didn't know say him was a good man. a good Christian. So now one Sunday morning, I'm going to make myself ready, I go to church. Him they start to call me Bratty. Bratty! Him they said to me, said, you was one little bratty boy. Yes, so they set me up on the road, and the name kind of stick it. And from that time, all the while I'm in town, they'd follow him up and start from them to call me Bratty. It's so them call me till now. But my true name my mother gave me is Solomon, for true. So Solomon is talking there about this uncle who was rather corporal in his approach to raising children, and eventually called him Bratty. Now, a few pages later, right, you hear Aston's desire for Bratty, Solomon. And so, of course, this is Aston's interior life. He had never told anyone that, yes, believe it. He had always wanted, really and truly, above all else, to curl his fingers around Solomon's surely guinea-sized, if you know the guinea-sized fruits about that big or so, right? Guinea-sized black balls. Now you hear the racializing, huh? Guinea-sized black balls, and squeeze his hand around the surely plant-and-thick, uncircumcised black hood. Uncircumcised, of course he thought, especially with country people, so what does he know, but okay. And rub it, no, I mean, what does Aston know, right? He's making these assumptions. And rub it, after which he would raise his hand to his face in order to sniff and lick and suck what he knew would be the strong roadside sweat crotch smell, pure hood. Then pull that hood that was not brown like his own, but black as the ace of Ross cloth spades, he thought, stiffening more at the thought. That's a swear word, of course, Ross cloth, right? I'm sorry, my parents. How much stiffer could his own hood get before it tore a path through his zipper? Pull it, the fisherman's road sweaty, sea salty, rancid cock, into his mouth, in it, in order to taste and suck sweat and strong hood smell, and ultimately Bratty's charging heat that would have jetted so powerfully power out of that engorged black man hood. Then he would have called out in his most dangerous, utterly unspeakable imagination, words like, Bratty, come breathe me. Bratty, brethren, fuck me now, Bratty. Come grind your cocky, hot in my pussy. Solomon's black man hood filling up his pussy, he imagined, and roughing it in a way nothing his wife, Carol, nor any woman could ever have done or would be able to do. Maybe he doesn't know that, but, and so on. He had never told anyone about all the kisses he had imagined that Bratty would have bestowed upon him, kisses mouth to mouth, as the other man threw his fisherman's arms around him and held him. And so here in this passage, I learned this after I wrote it, because I was really trying to inhabit Aston's imagination. But I hear there not only the fetishization happening, but the kind of confluence of violence and desire and intimacy at the same time. That along with this desire for some kind of sexual violence that is part of his fetish, we also hear, I'm hearing as well, this very strong desire. Now, in Leighton Leanne Norbrook, there's a scene in the garden. Michael is the gardener who works for the family, the Leighton's family, the Andersons, those Andersons of Norbrook. Right, and they do actually have sex at one point in one of the household staff working rooms on the edge of the garden, right, where actually the older gardener, Henry, works, Michael's uncle. And here's what happens in this scene. It had seemed as if all at once their faces had come together. Hands, arms, crotches, and hands and crotches. Without the saddling or comfort of language, except for a very few soft words, the boy, as Leighton imagines him, the boy had whispered in his ear, you can suck mode, and one, hold it tight and make it stand up. So hold it tight to not get erection, right? Words like that, which he was sure he had returned with similar requests, little had been said. Suddenly he, Leighton, was smelling and tasting that black boy racialization, that black boy in him, within him, on him, and impossibly himself on the black boy, the boy who did not speak or chose not to speak English, speaks patois, and that fast, yes, that fast, he remembers everything was black. Night, skin, and the space in a Detroit that aims to grip the tightest. Although it was not possible, the black boy's tongue was in his mouth, his tongue in the black boy's, and smells, sweat, armpit stink, man smell, crotch, sweat, crotch, and hood smell. Lift up the hood, the penis, and sniff the tip. Sniff it before you suck it, before you put your mouth on it, before you smell it, before you breathe it, before you taste it. Unwashed hood after a full day. Ross and rank crotch. He was smelling it, rank sweat, flesh smell. So you see, smells also come very much into these, I think, what I experienced in reading it as a kind of invocation of masculinity and hypermasculinity that is simultaneously racialized. The two were kind of hand in glove with this fetishization of blackness. So going back to here, this malevolent desire, etc. Right, okay. So Aston simultaneously reviles that black body, as does Leighton. Leighton, unlike Aston, does actually sexually interact with the desired one. He kisses, as you heard, kisses, sucks, holds, and is in return, and this is important, in return he is kissed, sucked, held, and ultimately anally penetrated by Michael's nasty, dirty black boy flesh. And unlike Aston in regard to his fisherman, Leighton entertains no fantasies regarding Michael's possibly being an archangel. Later in the story out there, Aston refers to Ratty Solomon as an archangel, his archangel. But then what next? A writer preoccupied with these characters wants to know. And what about the photograph never taken, decades ago, that may have had a part in shaping and developing all this? These thoughts, questions, and explorations. All right, so part 2. This is a little milder, I think. Okay. The photograph never taken. The photograph that was never taken now lives only in my memory and appears once again before me, directly within my vision in a few minutes. For now, we are driving, my aunt, 2 cousins and I. In the company car, my uncle sent my aunt in to meet us at the Kingston airport. Driven by one of the chauffeurs my uncle's company used for some senior executives. My uncle was a senior executive at Jamaican Cultural Conference, JPS. My 2 cousins and I had just arrived in Jamaica from New York. They, like most of my family at the time, are permanent residents of Jamaica. I, this time, a member of the family in what we will only learn decades later, will have become more widely known as the diaspora. I will learn this in the same era that I discovered that we are post-colonial and a part of the global South. I am very envious of them for this privilege, the fact that they're able to experience glorious, magnificent Jamaica, as I see it then, every single day, all the time. We arrived at Palisado's airport, as it was called then, I don't know if any of you remember that, on an unforgivingly burning Caribbean midsummer early afternoon, sometime in the early 1970s. I'm still a very young child. My female cousin is a few months older, and my male cousin, her brother, several years older. They had both spent a few weeks at my parents' house in the Northeast Bronx. 2 of the places in New York City, my parents' house and the Bronx itself, where South, in an enthusiastic rough and tumble, energetically met North and continued in several languages that included Jamaican patois to insist on South. Now, back home, in the place that I love almost unbearably, the place that will inhabit my dreams for years and cause me to sob rackingly when back in New York, where I will so miss it, the place that at this time always seems slightly foreign to me and always exactly where I wish to be forever. I will spend the rest of the summer in my favorite uncle's home, as I have done in previous years, right up to the hated last day before the start of school back in New York. These family members live in the neighborhood of Norbrook, an area technically part of the parish of St. Andrew, and thus outside the city of Kingston proper, but often considered by locals then and now a suburban part of Kingston. Norbrook is, it seems to me, much more self-consciously upscaled today, in this time, than it was then. But even then, not so many years after Jamaica's becoming an independent nation in 1962, it was considered a stush or very uptown place to live. Not cheap, but in those days more a neighborhood of single-family homes and grassy open plots on which cattle and goats often could be seen grazing, rather than the more urbanized, traffic-heavy, cluttered gathering of homes and gated townhouse communities that sprawl around Norbrook Road into Manor Park today. The photograph never taken, but remembered, begins here, as the car pulls up my uncle's intimidatingly steep driveway and stops before the house that faces the gorgeous garden I remember. A lush expanse filled with mango and other fruit trees, a festival of tropical flowers, and a view of the distant, ever-teal Caribbean to the south. You can actually still see the airport runway back then. Now it's been obscured by all the gated communities, etc. And this time, as I say here, this time before the U.S. Embassy builds apartments directly across the street from the house, you can still see the airport from which we just drove, and planes taking off over the sea, heading east before they turn to the north, bound for New York, Miami, London, Toronto, and Barbados. Sorry. When we arrived, they're no longer a third world country, you know, so I have to start. Sorry. When we arrived, the household domestic staff, as I remember them, are standing awaiting us with their hands folded in front of them, smiling, all of them. Ida, in her maid's uniform and her cap. Fitzy, the gardener, an elderly man whose actual name to this day I don't know. Is it Fitzroy? Fitzgerald? And Frances, the woman who comes twice weekly to do our laundry. Is it in this moment, aware even as a child of their subservient postures, those folded hands and stiff, self-conscious postures as if awaiting the arrival of dignitaries, that I realize what no one in my family, and certainly no one I know in the middle class in Jamaica at the time will ever discuss. That is, that each of these working people, people who work for us and clean up after us, is dark-skinned. What black seems to mean in Jamaica, as opposed to brown, like us. These color designations also having powerful class associations. And that we, the children, call these big, grown-up, dark-skinned people by their first names, Ida, Fitzy, Frances, whereas we always address all people in the family, or play family, as aunt or uncle, this or that, and family friends as sometimes auntie, or uncle, or Mr. or Mrs., but never by their first names. This photograph that was never taken emblazoned itself on my memory that day and has never left my imagination. Footnoted and framed by innumerable nonverbal communications, many of them painful and actually indescribably appalling. Don't use the same dishes that they have used. They do not live in nice parts of Kingston because they are poor, yes. And thus, so whispered the tacit conventional wisdom, they are less than we are, of course. The photograph not taken and its addenda taught me, among other things, that if I was black in the United States, and also by virtue of that blackness, and my parents' status as third world immigrants, although from a middle class background status, myself of complicated class status, well, I was brown in Jamaica, at least among people of discernibly African descent, as well as amongst Chinese and Indo-Jamaicans. And thus, in spite of my unmistakably black hair, unlike my father's coolie hair, I was the recipient of innumerable privileges. As I later learned, although it would have been wonderful if I had been just a tad lighter brown, I fortunately possessed, according to the family, a good nose, and features that marked me as invincibly not one of the despised them. I believe that these lessons were powerful ones for the child, who even then in that pipsqueak stage, loved the word and knew intuitively that he wanted to do something with it. I'm sure that these lessons worked their way somehow into the questions I wanted to explore in the final work in my collection I mentioned before, The Torturer's Out There, The Torturer's Wife, set entirely in contemporary Jamaica and featuring a brown character, Aston, early middle age, educated, professional, from a similarly privileged brown middle-class Upper St. Andrew milieu. At several points in Out There, Aston, grieving over his recently murdered dear friend Carlton, who is also brown, but not from the same Upper St. Andrew privileged background, as would be discernible in his vocal tones and the nuances of his accent. I can still hear some of my aunts, no, my dear, and yes, my dear. Aston expresses sexual and romantic desire for a poor fisherman about whom you've already heard, Solomon Bratty James, whom Aston meets by chance one afternoon while driving through the parish of St. Thomas, one of Jamaica's poorest parishes, where Solomon lives, worships, and supports his family on apparently meager earnings. Aston Aston, incidentally, is married to a professional, well-educated woman who attended Campion College and Cornell. There's a tension between them because he went only to Calabar and UWI. As the person who wrote the story, but also as a reader of it, it was fascinating for me to watch Aston, whose, quote, complexion perfectly matched his wife's, Carol's, and had helped to produce even lighter children with wonderfully pliable hair, unquote. To watch him move uneasily through what appears to be his obsessive attraction to Solomon that soon enough takes on racialized or at least coloristic tones, as disclosed in the passage that I read to you before, the black is the ace of Ross, clot, spades, etc. Aston, in this profoundly fetishizing fantasy, imagines that Solomon's testicles are guinea-sized, okay, which going by measures of the local fruit would make them, surely to use Aston's language, fairly large. He hasn't seen them, but that's what he imagines, right? Similarly, he imagines Solomon's penis as plantain thick, which would make it quite thick in keeping with the general size, at least as far as I've seen them, of Jamaican plantains. And then using the more vulgar term for penis, hood, he imagines Solomon's penis not to be brown like his own, similarly to Leighton, but black as the ace of Ross, clot, spades. The Ross, clot swear word having a particularly profane and, given Ross, clot's literal meaning, a cloth used to wipe fecal matter from between the buttocks, also a dirty and shamed and or shaming emphasis, I think. It was interesting for me as the writer, and hopefully it will be interesting for a reader, to note that Aston never in this passage makes reference to Solomon's penis without thinking of it as Solomon's black hood. The fisherman's penis and body always, in Aston's deeply colorist imagination, racialized. Yet, while Aston clearly sexually, and the story seems to suggest romantically and with a highly romanticized idealism, seems to desire Solomon, he also struggles with his feelings of revulsion over the prospect of physical connection with the fisherman. Revulsion caused possibly by Solomon's color, and possibly, certainly, by his social class, and all the attendant olfactory pleasantness in the fetishization associated with poverty, sweat, body odor, general stink, and the stereotypical stink associated with the filth of blackness, all of which also appear to operate as utterly verboten aphrodisiacs for Aston, and also as markers of absolute masculinity. And I just want to read a little footnote that I wrote here to remind myself, while thinking about how to conceptualize and approach the parameters of this talk for Rachel, accompanied all on Rachel, I was interested to observe on several gay, male, sex, and hookup websites, for example, Gaydar, Squirt, Grindr, Manhunt, and Adam for Adam, amongst them, that a desire for strong body smells, often stereotypically associated with men, and real or macho men in particular, was often visible in website members' lists of their likes. The smells of unwashed armpits, crotches, feet, and in some cases backsides were found to be highly erotic, valued and privileged as the smells and even the stink of a real man who on the face of it felt no shame about and was in fact proud of his very masculine man smells. That's one word, man smells. Some of these smell fetishes seem to accompany, or at least operate not far removed from, fetishes related to the visual performance and presentation of working class stereotypical roles, drag, associated with hyper-masculinity, construction worker, police worker, soldier, general manual laborer, truck driver, road laborer, etc. So real men have some stink, perhaps. Additionally, alongside racialized fetishizations of Solomon, Aston also fetishizes him by way of class, a fetishization in Aston's imagination perhaps ultimately inseparable from the racial colorist fetishization, imagining his, quote, road sweaty, sea salty, rancid cock, unquote. Solomon's cock, another profane and rude word selected by Aston, that as I understood him, he would most certainly never use in public with anyone except his friend Carlton. Carlton had a very rude sense of humor. Another word linked in erotic fetishizing association by Aston with the realities of a fisherman's sweat-producing work, so real sweat from the difficult work. The road, sweaty, sea, salty, rancid cock. that is also black as the ace of Ross-clawed spades, the planted thick hood. All of Aston's projections onto Solomon's body appear to reveal an erotic imagination powerfully informed, clearly, obviously, by history of slavery and colonialism. An imagination burdened in the present day with the baggage of what many would correctly, appropriately term internalized racism, perhaps. Simultaneously, Aston's imagination strikes me as preoccupied with very particularized constructions of masculinity and hypermasculinity, calibrated in part by descending degrees of darkness. The darker the skin, presumably the more racially intact in terms of pure blackness and or Africanness, and thus supposedly less tainted by the feminizing and ultimately racially tainting presence of whiteness. I keep in mind here not only the sacrosanct notion, ideology, enslaved in Western colonial contexts of white womanhood as a defining cornerstone of all things desirably feminine, but also the not much discussed fact that during slavery and afterward, in every locale in which slavery occurred, black men were also vulnerable to sexual assault and rape by the white men who for centuries had power over their bodies. And of course, in Jamaica, we certainly don't want to talk about that either. We don't want to talk about rape of women either, as I mentioned this morning. The darker the skin, presumably the larger the penis and testicles, the more rancid as the bodies of savages or the great unwashed are known per conventional colonialist wisdom to be rancid. And finally, the more masculine the man, a real black man, as opposed to a less real, more civilized, and certainly, always in quotes, at least in Jamaica, feminized brown man, and thus closer to the pure savage. And yet, interestingly, the indigenous savage person doesn't enter into this construction of masculinity, right? It's black, or African black, etc. So, finally, given these considerations, it was really also fascinating for me as both reader and writer to observe Aston only a few paragraphs later, imagining the darker-skinned Solomon penetrating him quite forcefully with his pussy. You heard me read from that section. It seems liberating and breathtakingly reckless to me for Aston to imagine himself possessing, owning, having a penetrable male pussy, as it did for his deceased friend Carlton, who says the same kind of language. At this point in the story, Aston, in a matter of moments, travels through complex gender, race, and color dynamics and paradigms, imagining once again in feverish tones Solomon, quote, taking him from behind, unquote, accent on the taking, right? Implying the possibility of sanctioned or unsanctioned sexual violence, in addition to the from behind, suggesting the possibility of a surprise attack, sanctioned surprise attack upon the vulnerable male anus, which in those moments of Aston's verboten, secret, erotic imagination transposes that anus to the utterly unspeakable but highly imaginable male pussy. And I was really fascinated with exploring this because this idea of the male pussy that so many men have mentioned to me, in private mostly, with all kinds of demands, if you know what I mean, seems so unspeakable. I said, there's got to be something I'm missing here, and what is it, right? At the same time that so much misogyny and sexism prevails amongst many of these men, yeah? So that women are scorned and loathed in many ways, and yet, this idea of the so-called pussy, which is not necessarily a complimentary thing, but anyway, right, comes up. So what would it mean for the characters, for me to explore them? And so what exactly does it mean for Aston to, quote, shout in his most dangerous, sorry dear, come my pen dear, come no? Okay, sorry, utterly unspeakable imagination, words like bratty, come breed me, come make me pregnant, come breed me, yeah? And grind your cock hot in him a pussy. And then for him to imagine Solomon's black manhood filling up his pussy and roughing it, right? Roughing it, he says. He'd imagined all that, the violent part, and so on. What does it mean indeed for Aston to possess these imaginings of Solomon, ultimately his countryman, in a nation in which all are alleged to be, quote, out of many, one, according to Jamaica's national, unquote, according to Jamaica's national motto. For a critical theorist or a literary critic, which I'm not, as well as for a general reader, which I think I might be, there might be many meanings here. Colors and shadings out of many, quote, several. For me as the writer who became the reader, who yearns once again on another day to write more and then more and more still, these passages and the entire story and the other story, Leighton, Leanne, Norbrook, compel me to return to those moments when, in Jamaica, as recounted at the beginning of these reflections, I heard people say things either exactly like or quite similar to what Aston thought about Solomon. People, mostly men, who had expressed erotic and romantic interest in men or women or both, and who considered themselves men or women or sometimes both, and who themselves spanned a range of colors. These reflections now compel me to remember the colored and the multivalent tones of that erotic, if it is actually erotic, that erotic language, the tones of those colors and the quantifiable differences in skin color between ourselves, the brown privileged family and the long ago photograph not taken with their black servants, and those darker people, the darker people beyond our servants, all of them who worked for us, those big grown-up people whom we children called by their first names, even as we knew so little about their lives beyond their work in my uncle's garden. For some reason it's not quite, it will though. Miss, here we are, in my uncle's garden and in my uncle's kitchen, that sprawling, magnificent garden. Those people who, in that long ago photograph never taken, stand together awaiting our arrival from the north with their hands stiffly clasped and those attendant smiles on their faces. That photograph, that whether any of us then knew it or not, was indeed a meeting of South and North and so much more. That untaken photo that remains as fresh in my memory and as relevant now as it was then to our social reality and history, and to the social reality and historical experience of an entire diaspora and beyond. And so perhaps it is indeed possible that that untaken photograph, like a language of verboten, forbidden desire, uttered fleetingly in a queer party, and even like this attempt to gather those disparate but connected moments of recollection, can enable or even transpose to the conjuring of flesh that occurs in writing and elsewhere. One of the many places where, in writing, able for once at last to jettison the strictures that define what is or should be or must remain unspeakable, unimaginable, and certainly, as we heard this morning, illegal, punishable by social or literal death, Brown just might meet, and for once, perhaps for the first time, see not only black, but also black's vast, illimitable depth. That meeting, that place of meeting, just might be what I've called in other writing I've done, our Caribbean Sea of we, W-E. Our sea of history, and more, in which, beneath which, that sea in fact, beneath which, Brown, Black, and those many others in this context will glance all around, each at the other, then extend something, a hand maybe, and then say to one or the other, just very quietly, well now, look. Look at this, why don't you? Just look. Thanks.